There's an awful lot of material to cover in the chapter regarding child maltreatment, and this is going to be a rather superficial review of some of that material. Because of the nature of this topic, it's very broad, and child maltreatment generally is considered to include child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and child neglect. This lecture is going to focus upon physical abuse and sexual abuse and leave the other two areas to discussions perhaps later in the semester. First, we'll look at a definition of child physical abuse. And as you can see, there are a number of different descriptions for this depending upon where you refer. Health and Human Services in 1988 established a harm standard which indicated that children are physical abuse victims if they have observable injuries that last at least 48 hours. This is an interesting thing because when I worked in child protection back in the 1970s even, as well as later on, one of the standards we would consider when trying to determine whether a parent had used physical discipline or was physically abusive was how long the marks and bruises lasted after the episode of discipline or abuse. So this is sort of implying that this arises from this harm standard by HHS. There's also an endangerment standard that is much broader and says that children are abuse victims if they're thought to be substantially at risk for injury. And that at risk is a part of our statutes, but it is something that sometimes can be very difficult to prove in court if indeed Child Protective Services is moving to protect a child by removal. Now here's the Alaska statutes that says that physical injury or neglect, mental injury, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, or maltreatment of a child under age 18 by a person under circumstances that indicate that the child's health or welfare is harmed or threatened. That is the definition of child maltreatment in the Alaska statutes. And it is the standard by which reports that are phoned into the Child Protection Office is often measured against to determine whether or not the state has a right to investigate complaints. There are some other definitions here from CAPTA and from the CDC that also talks about imminent risk of serious harm, failure to act, and also whether the use of physical force was intentional or not. So the question is, what is normal violence in child rearing? Slapping, paddling, spanking. Spanking is not against the law in Alaska, and paddling is something that a lot of people swear by as far as the best way to parent a child when correction is necessary. Anger, physical attack, and pain are involved between two people of vastly different size, weight, and strength. Such behavior is commonly accepted as proper exercise of adult authority over children. It is kind of interesting that parents can use physical force against their own children, but were they to do that with the neighbor child, they'd be arrested. This suggests to you that we're still dealing with vestiges of the property right of men with their wives and children. Children are the only group in society that may be hit legally, and Strauss says that spanking, even spanking and hitting of any form, is harmful because it condones the use of violence in the child's mind and also contributes to the violence in society in general. Learning theorists believe that it's ineffective in achieving the results that parents believe that they're going to achieve through paddling and spanking, and neurobiologists tell us that harsh punishment affects brain development negatively. There is this myth that physical punishment doesn't harm children if it's conducted within the bounds of reasonableness. But experts will give us a lot of reasons why punishment may be counterproductive, such as that it doesn't have anything to do with helping children learn why their behavior is wrong. The physiological response that occurs in the child while being physically punished might prevent the child from learning the lesson that is intended to be taught. Physical punishment demonstrates that using force enables one to control others, and this is often the case when someone is bigger and more powerful than the other person. This is a lesson we don't want to impart to our children. It's likely that children are going to attribute hostile motivation to others. Children will probably grow up fearing their parents and will create an odd link between love and violence. When parents use physical discipline and the threat of physical discipline to control the behavior of their children, it may be effective when the parents are present, but when the parents are not there, oftentimes those children will act out because they haven't developed the internal controls necessary to manage their own behavior without having some external authority watching over them. Physical discipline is positively correlated in many different studies with other forms of family violence. It's connected to cheating and telling lies on the part of the child victim, and also contributes to subsequent antisocial behavior in children. About 1 in 7 children experienced child abuse and neglect in 2019. That's the last year that statistics are gathered by the CDC. This information does come from the Center for Disease Control. 1,840 children died from abuse and neglect in the United States in 2019. That is a figure that is increasing year by year most recently. We'll see here a little later that the overall rates of child maltreatment and many of the problems that we're looking at this week are falling nationally, but certainly the rates of the deaths of children because of abuse and neglect is increasing. Children who live in poverty experience more abuse and neglect from a statistical standpoint. This can place a lot of stress on families, which increases the risk of abuse and neglect. Rates of abuse and neglect are 5 times higher for children in families with low socioeconomic status compared to children in families with higher socioeconomic status. Child maltreatment is very costly. In the U.S. alone, the total lifetime economic burden associated with child abuse and neglect was about $428 billion in 2015, and that rivals the costs of several other public health problems, as is mentioned here. Kids who are abused and neglected suffer immediate physical injuries like cuts, bruises, broken bones, and also suffer emotional and psychological problems such as impaired social emotional skills and anxiety. The child abuse and neglect and other adverse childhood experiences have a tremendous impact on lifelong health status, opportunities, and well-being if they're left untreated. Exposure to violence in childhood increases the risk of injury, future violence, victimization and perpetration, substance abuse, sexually transmitted infections, delayed brain development, lower educational attainment, and limited economic opportunities. You can see how the problem of child abuse and neglect translates into a great expense to society just from looking at this over the years. Chronic abuse results in toxic stress, which changes brain development and increases the risk for other problems like PTSD and learning and attention and memory issues later on. Physically abused children exhibit lower intellectual and cognitive functioning compared to other children, and of course, this is going to mean that they're going to do more poorly in school and likely have lower economic potential later in life. Corporal punishment is associated with many negative outcomes well into adulthood, including the lack of internalized morals, poor mental health, increased aggression, antisocial behavior, and abusive behavior towards others. Again, if the child is managed and controlled through force and through fear, then that child does not develop the internalized sense of right and wrong that other children will develop, and is likely to run into many scrapes with the law and have a lot of problems in their relationships with others when they don't have that fearful figure lording over them. There are different mediators and moderators of abuse effects. Some of them may help to lower the impact of abuse and neglect, and others will increase it. So, for instance, obviously the frequency, severity, and duration of abuse. Again, chronic abuse has other lifelong problems as opposed to single occurrences of physical abuse that individuals will suffer for years and years. Polyvictimization, those children who are victims of abuse and neglect and sexual abuse or combinations thereof, emotional abuse, are going to also have more serious problems associated with the abuse that they experience. Prior involvement with Child Protective Services, when there are substantiated findings in previous investigations by CPS workers, that has been shown to increase the risk for further abuse for children later. Stress in the family or lack thereof, sociocultural factors such as living in a violent community or a society that accepts violence as appropriate response in certain situations. The child's intellectual functioning, relationships between the victim and the abuser oftentimes will have some sort of moderating effect upon the abuse. Symptoms of trauma and child's temperament and social support also have a moderating effect. If the child has someone to turn to outside the home, sometimes that can help reduce some of the impact of the abuse. One of the things that happens in abusive situations is that the parent-child bond becomes characterized by insecure attachment. This is something that we've talked about in other discussions in this course. The parent in these situations is the source of both safety and danger. That again is love and fear combined together all at one time. And obviously creates a serious paradox in relationship and a great deal of difficulty in the child sorting through his or her feelings about the parent. The attachment that's formed sometimes is formed because they want to please the parent to avoid any future maltreatment and isn't the kind of attachment that makes for secure attachments later in life. Social dysfunction, attention deficit disorder or characteristics of that, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, depression, these have all been clinically linked to experience of physical abuse in childhood. NCAN's study in 2008 showed that a little over 13% of physically abused children were less than a week old. That's an interesting statistic and a horrifying statistic. And I went back to the source of this, which came from the Barnett text, in fact, to see if there's some explanation for this. And I really can't sort through this, but I did have some notes in the margin and said that this may have something to do with how physical abuse is defined in that particular study, and I'm curious as to whether or not that might include SIDS deaths and those kinds of things. Most of the studies about physical abuse suggest that the frequency of it will peak somewhere between elementary and junior high years. You'll see later on that overall maltreatment rates decline as children get older, but physical abuse rates actually peak in that age, in around puberty. Boys are slightly greater risk for child physical abuse than girls. It occurs more often among economically and socially disadvantaged families for reasons we had discussed earlier. That does not mean that children in better advantaged homes and families aren't at risk for abuse and neglect, because they certainly are, and that occurs in those families as well. There are studies that suggest that African American children are at greater risk for physical abuse, and children with disabilities are twice as likely to be physically abused as those without physical disabilities. And there's a note here that CPS workers sometimes treat abuse of disabled children differently and seem to be less likely to initiate an investigation attributing the abuse to the difficulties that are associated with raising disabled children. It doesn't protect the children, but that's something that is a phenomena that's been seen. We turn for a few slides to the topic of child sexual abuse, and understand both in terms of physical abuse and sexual abuse, this lecture doesn't give these topics adequate treatment, and certainly you'll want to do more studies on these topics if you have an interest in learning as much as you can about it. But one question when you're considering the definition of child sexual abuse is, where do sexual interactions become abusive? At one point, how do we define sexual abuse? Does it have to have body contact or not? Well, probably not, because individuals engage young children in pornography and photographs, and there's sometimes grooming that goes on that doesn't involve touching. Is that considered to be sexual abuse or not? Different definitions say yes and no. Does the perpetrator intend it to be stimulating? Does the perpetrator have power and control over the victim? Is there an age difference between the perpetrator and the victim? What kinds of abuse actually happened? Do we have definitions that broadly define sexual abuse, or is it very narrowly defined? And also looking at history when we're looking back at interactions of individuals, and also cultures, that from one culture to another, different kinds of behaviors are appropriate in some cultures that are not in other societies and other cultures. It's something that cultural context is always very, very important to keep in mind. You're going to run into a fair number of, we used to refer to them as kiddie perpetrators, child perpetrators of sexual interactions with younger children. That's sort of an emerging area as far as studies go, and is something that can be very controversial. Law enforcement oftentimes doesn't want to prosecute and press charges against younger children, even though sometimes the situation can be clearly abusive in nature. Definitions for sexual abuse can be simple or very complex and really depend a lot upon the context of the circumstance, just kind of like I was just telling you, and the purpose. There are simple definitions. Berliner in 2000 said sexual abuse involves any sexual activity with a child below the age of consent. Cross and Tower, who wrote a book called Understanding Child Abuse and Neglect, said that the use of a child for the sexual gratification of an adult constitutes child sexual abuse. And our current author, Fries, and her associates say there are many issues involved in what should be labeled as child sexual abuse. So she really didn't come forward with a definition. And I think probably that reflects the confusion and the complication around defining sexual abuse for children. But when we look at the situation, as this mentions here again, culturally speaking, it's very important to know what is defined as normal touching in that culture. There's a problem in determining the prevalence of child sexual abuse because, well, for a number of different reasons, and one of them is disclosure variability. The prevalence rate is really affected by this disclosure rate, and accuracy of records that are compiled by Child Protective Services are from time to time called into question, and it's believed that the rate, well, this says maybe more than 4 to 6 times higher than what the CPS records indicate. It isn't necessarily that workers are concealing information, as it is sometimes how they perceive the behaviors or the incidents that they're investigating. The other problem here is that most victims don't disclose their victimization immediately, sometimes not for many years. And so there's so many different factors that affect whether or not a victim of sexual abuse is willing to disclose, including the relationship to the perpetrator, because oftentimes, as you'll see here, the perpetrator is in the family and the victim has conflicting feelings of love that prevents them from wanting to get the perpetrator in trouble, so to speak. Also, oftentimes the non-offending parent who becomes aware of this may pressure the child to not say anything because the non-offending parent depends upon the presence of the offending parent for economic stability, for instance. Also, the severity of the abuse, and I want to say that molestation is molestation, and there isn't such a thing as a gentle molestation or a kindly molested. When a child's molested, a child's molested. But whether or not the victim sees it as severe enough also impacts whether or not it may be reported. There may be developmental and cognitive factors involved. There could be fear of consequences. Females are more likely to disclose than males. For males, oftentimes they're very reluctant to disclose. Little boys sometimes worry that the experience of sexual abuse actually makes them be a girl, and because of the confusion about all of that for very young little boys. But older boys are concerned about implications, for instance, involving the homosexual nature if the perpetrator was male, and also because of their physiological response to the sexual abuse may make them feel as though they were a participant in it rather than a victim. And of course, the perpetrators in these situations, in the process of grooming both male and female victims, are very diligent in making sure that the children see themselves as being a participant, being partially responsible. Sometimes the perpetrator will threaten to harm the child's pet or tell the child that his or her mother won't love them anymore, those kinds of things. And so there's a number of different things that block children from revealing what's occurred. When you have allegations of sexual abuse that would suggest the possibility of physical evidence, then getting medical exams are really indicated after disclosures. And child advocacy centers help to make it easier for victims to do so. For those of you that may not be familiar with CACs, essentially social workers, child protection workers, mental health counselors perhaps, law enforcement, medical personnel all get together in a location that's child-friendly while the child is interviewed by a forensic interviewing expert, and other people will view this generally through a one-way mirror. And with agreements of those agencies that participate, that interview is the one that is considered valid for all of their purposes. Without CACs, what happens sometimes is victims are interviewed over and over and over again, just as a part of normal memory. The stories are going to change some. None of us remember things exactly the same way. In fact, if we do, sometimes that's an indication that we've been coached. But generally speaking, when we remember things, we forget some things. We remember new things in the retelling. And the defense in criminal cases, for instance, will oftentimes use those discrepancies to undermine the credibility of the child for a jury that doesn't understand these things. So the CACs are a great stopgap measure to prevent that from happening. There were studies that were done in the 1990s, for instance, about the suggestibility of children, and there have been a number of studies done since then. There's a lot of it out there in your professional resources to look at that suggest that young children are very suggestible when it comes to memory, that a person who either through being clumsy in their interviewing or being intentional in the process can suggest things to kids, and children begin to see them as real even though they didn't occur. That's not to say that child victims shouldn't be believed, because as is mentioned here in this slide, children rarely lie about sexual abuse. Young children in particular will rarely lie about sexual abuse. So this is not to say that we don't want to believe children who report these things, but we need to understand that children are suggestible, and this is something that, again, if you're acting to protect children from a perpetrator, this is something that sometimes the other side will want to focus upon. But by the age of 10 or 11, that suggestibility isn't any different than it might be if the victim were an adult. And there are ways to assess into the statements of children to help verify that the events that the child talks about actually did occur. I'm not going to go into that here because that's really for forensic interviewing training, but there are things you can do to guard against that. But there are many factors that confuse the memories of young children, and leading questions are one of them. And so again, it's very important if you're conducting interviews with child sexual abuse victims that you have been trained in forensic interviewing of young children, and there's a lot of good trainings out there for that purpose. The CACs will have an interviewer who has had that training. The trauma of sexual abuse can have very debilitating effects on memory, and according to some researchers, others think that it enhances memories, so it's debatable about its impact. There is a debate out there about what we call the repressed memory syndrome, where individuals later on remember abuse that occurred, and the defense wants to maintain that the therapist helped the victim to generate these memories. And while children themselves will rarely lie about sexual abuse, sometimes false claims or false reports may be made because of developmental issues or because they've been coached by adults. And as a developmental issue, I would say, and again, this doesn't mean don't believe teenagers, but the older the child gets, the more that child may have some secondary motives in filing reports. Please understand, I am not saying don't trust older children's statements. I'm just saying that you really should assess the situation, because sometimes teenagers, for instance, will find that there's secondary gain and the reports give them some power in the household or something like that. Again, understand that children rarely lie about sexual abuse. Repressed memories among older victims do exist, and oftentimes they're centered around sexual abuse. The study here of 100 documented sexual abuse victims between the ages of 10 months and 12 years, where sexual abuse was again documented. When questioned 17 years later, over a third of them didn't recall those incidents. It's widely believed that the official records underestimate the actual incidence of sexual crimes, not only with child protection, but also in law enforcement as well. And the trends indicate a decline in reporting rates of child sexual abuse. It appears that this has shown over the years that this has kind of held steady, that the substantiations in child sexual abuse have declined, but is that an actual decrease in child sexual abuse? Have we been so effective in working with individuals that they're standing up for themselves and kids know when to go to a trusted adult and those things? Or is it just that people just don't report as much anymore? There's some research that suggests this decline could be real, but I think the jury's still out on that. But still, we think it's underreported. First of all, sexual abuse is difficult to prove because there's lack of witnesses, and the witnesses usually are young children who oftentimes, again, they may be suggestible. The defense may find ways to undermine the reliability of the child's statements and such. Kids are often not believed when they tell, and that becomes a real problem. Family members often don't report the abuse when they do become aware of it because it's so disruptive to family dynamics. I can remember one situation with an adolescent female where she reported on a stepfather molesting her, and the stepfather was in jail, and during a supervised visit, virtually the first thing the mother said to the young girl was, "I hope you're satisfied now because we don't have money to buy you clothing anymore because your stepdad's in jail." That kind of pressure on children will cause them oftentimes to recant their stories. And in fact, that particular child did recant, and it was a very, very difficult situation I remember working with. Investigators have difficulty discussing sex with children, and that's something that if you're going to work with kids, you want to, we all have difficulty sometimes when the subject of sex comes up as far as talking about it, because most of us are raised in an environment where we don't talk about sex. Certainly, talking about sex with younger children have all sorts of issues for individuals inside, and so it's important that we work on becoming very comfortable in dealing with that topic with children, certainly before you begin to interview them about child sexual abuse. When it's reported, as has been the case in other areas, sometimes the services are just very poorly coordinated. The taboo that is associated with sexual abuse doesn't only stigmatize the perpetrator, but can also stigmatize the victim as well. And again, the false allegation movement that either says the kids are making these stories up to get back at their parents or that these repressed memories aren't real, this movement has made reporting more difficult for some people. The age of child sexual abuse victims varies from infancy to 18 years of age, but most cases between 12 and 14 years of age. Again, there's that age of middle school puberty where this occurrence seems to peak a little bit. Victims tend to be more female than male. Their race and ethnicity is very heterogeneous. Their SES, as we mentioned earlier, it varies, but children in lower socioeconomic statuses are more vulnerable for a number of different reasons. It isn't only about the stress in the household, but it may also be that their parents are away from the home working a lot and supervision is reduced, and so they're just more vulnerable to other adults because of that. And also the potential for self-blame among victims of child sexual abuse, including little children, exists and is very strong. Kids that are at higher risk for sexual abuse include those who are socially isolated. That, of course, is a common characteristic in our families that we're discussing this semester. And social isolation prevents the child from being able to compare their situation, their relationships with the abuser and with their other parent, comparing that to how other kids get along, what's right in other homes and what isn't. It keeps them from being able to develop close relationships where they might disclose to someone. Keeps them from being around informed adults who might be able to recognize some red flags, on and on. Perpetrators know these things and will isolate their victims. Children who have less supervision, the kids with latchkey kids that have parents working, and this is very common these days, both in single parent and in two-parent homes where parent is often out working 2-3 jobs in order to make ends meet in this economy. And children are sometimes left to their own devices, even though parents may be checking in on cell phones and doing their best. These kids become more vulnerable to the advances of adults. Particularly, one of the things we learn about perpetrators is that they know how to identify those kids who just don't have adults around them, and they'll capitalize sometimes on that child's desire to have a solid relationship with an adult. Sexual abuse is more likely to occur for children with parents who have been abused themselves. Studies indicate particularly mothers oftentimes have more difficulty in recognizing when their daughters, for instance, are being sexually abused if it happened to themselves, and particularly with mothers who have not received treatment. If you haven't dealt with your own issues, your own abuse issues as a child, now you're an adult and you have children who may be going through the same thing, it's going to be very difficult for you to deal with your children's issues if you haven't dealt with your own. And so sometimes those mothers don't see things or turn a blind eye or feel powerless to do anything. And also studies have showed that in homes where parents abuse alcohol, boys are also much more vulnerable to sexual abuse. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they're just not going to be supervised as closely. Here's a graph that demonstrates the number of cases of child abuse in the United States in 2019 by age. This only goes to 9 years of age. What's remarkable here about this is that you can see that children less than 1 year of age are the victims of cases of child abuse much more than other children. I would expect to see the rate drop more among school-age children in this chart demonstrates, and maybe another chart will show us something differently. Because once kids are no longer isolated, preschool kids oftentimes are considered to be at higher risk just because they don't interact with people outside the home as much as school-age kids do. Now, in this day and age, many kids are in daycare, so this may be one of the reasons why there's less of a pronounced difference. But certainly, small children are subject to abuse much more than other ages. Now, again, the definition of child abuse here, I am guessing involves neglect also. Just because. But I couldn't figure it out from the website. Here's another chart. It does sort of reflect some of what I was thinking I was looking for. This extends the maltreatment reports. And now this says child maltreatment, not child abuse. So this would likely include all forms of child maltreatment here. But you do see that the numbers begin to fall as kids get into school. Also, as they get older, they're better informed. They're a little better able to protect themselves. And again, I don't want to put the onus of that on children, but that is one factor. Sometimes older children are able to find people to go to. They're able to even to say no sometimes and to take steps necessary to protect themselves much more than younger children can. But again, you see here, children below 1 year of age, much higher likelihood. Another reason why you don't see this rise in middle school in that 12 to 14 age range, there is a slight increase there. But we talked about an increase both in sexual abuse and physical abuse during that age. And I think this is also including emotional abuse and neglect. I can only surmise. We'll talk a little bit about the adults who are abusive. We'll deal with this more in the learning unit when we talk about batterers, and I'm going to try to work in some material on those who are physically and sexually abusive also in that learning unit. But just a brief look at this. Younger parents are more likely than older parents to physically mistreat their children. Likely because they don't have the skills yet, perhaps, and they haven't also settled their own growth and become more stable in their own personality, most likely. Males physically abuse children more so than females. African American, Latino, and American Indian Alaska Native parents are proportionally overrepresented among abusers. Asian parents are less represented proportionally. Birth parents are the perpetrators in the majority of physical abuse cases, although, again, this could be affected by how the data is gathered. And all of these tables, I just wish I had more information about them. So before you take what you read here as Bible, please do some background research on these areas. Single parents are overrepresented among abusers, with those living with cohabitating partners having the highest rate. So I don't know that I consider somebody living with a partner a single parent, but perhaps those parents do. It depends on whether the cohabitating parent or cohabitating partner is functioning as a parent or not, I suppose. But anyway, those living with another person have the highest rates among abusers. Single parents are higher than those with two parents in the home. That makes sense, I think, because of stress levels. And children cared for by grandparents are less apt to be abused than those cared by their parents. Those people who physically abuse children have emotional and behavioral difficulties, like is mentioned here, and one of those is deficits in empathy, a limited ability to understand the impact of their behavior as it affects others, a limited ability to stand in another person's shoes. This is one of those things that is a hallmark of sexual abusers and physical abusers and batterers. Rigidity, low self-esteem, oftentimes substance abuse, a low tolerance for frustration, poor skills as far as problem solving is concerned. Substance abuse problems are significantly related to recurrence of child physical abuse reports, and I can attest to that very much so. Oftentimes in Kenai, and I used to, when I was there, would keep pretty diligent track of statistics about our investigations, our substantiations, removals, and those kinds of things. It might interest you to know that in the Kenai office, because everybody thinks that what child protection does is remove children from the families. And in fact, only 1 in 20 investigations that we went out on, I think where we substantiated the findings, resulted in court action. And a significant number of those resulting in court action were what we called non-emergency petitions, where we did not seek removal of children, but instead sought legal authority to intervene and essentially protect children in their own homes through the provision of services to parents. So among those cases where removal became necessary, almost always there was a significant aspect of serious substance abuse in the parents. That doesn't mean that because a parent was abusing substances that we removed kids. What I'm saying is that it was a significant problem in those cases where we did remove them in almost all situations. There is some evidence to suggest that abusive parents tend to automatically interpret ambiguous child behaviors in negative ways, and that ties in a lot to the rigidity and low frustration tolerance and inability to solve problems. There are family and interpersonal difficulties with these individuals. There's tension with a spouse or partner, probably has a history of abuse in his or her own childhood, likely few positive social interactions outside of the home, and it may very well be socially isolated. Abusive parents report more conflict in their families of origin, have fewer interactions with their own children, and are more likely to physically abuse their marital partner. There's all sorts of problems with parenting as far as these individuals are concerned. They oftentimes disregard their children's needs, probably don't recognize them because of their low levels of empathy. They have poor child management skills, use of physical discipline being the primary means. They're inconsistent with their parenting, which sets up a lot of behavioral issues with their children. They probably have negative views of their kids and have unrealistic expectations of them, certainly experience their parenting as stressful and are oftentimes very verbally aggressive towards their children. And there are also biological factors with these individuals. They tend to report a lot of physical health problems and disabilities. They're overreactive physiologically, and they have neuropsychological deficits. They probably have a high score in the ACEs studies, and that this may explain some of these physical problems. These persons are hyper-responsive to stimuli related to their children, such things as crying and tantruming and those kinds of things. Now we take a look at just a superficial look right now at adults who sexually abuse their children. Single parents are overrepresented. Single parents living with a cohabitated partner have higher rates. This is the same thing as physical abuse. Children in these homes have a rate 10 times higher than those living with both biological parents. Cohabitating partner, the last statement about 10 times higher talks about biological parents. So a single parent who is remarried and is a step-parent in the home isn't living with a cohabitating partner. So these statistics don't quite connect, but you get the picture. The age of sexual abusers tend to be, oftentimes at least, between the ages of 30 and 40. Of course, it can be any age. 17% of these are under 18 years of age. They aren't really adults. More likely to be males, quite a lot. 93% are male, and there has been a lot of studies about female perpetrators, and treatment is developing and difficult to find. I remember one particular training, now this was some years ago, that I went to in working with sex offenders. There was a workshop on working with female offenders, and the professional who gave the workshop talked about going to a women's prison in Oregon and working with the women there who had been arrested and jailed for sexual abuse, and referred to it as a scary experience. So I'm not sure what that meant, but they're understudied, this group, and there may be more of them out there than we know of at this point. The relationship also, is it someone in the family or outside the family? This varies with the age of the child victim. And there's a 2018 study that looks at the cases over about almost a 30-year period that showed that 62% of the offenders, that's almost two-thirds of the offenders of children 11 or younger, were family members. Now, again, I'm assuming that includes step-parents. 39% of the offenders of adolescents were family members. So you see it's almost flipped. Adolescents are better able to get out of the social circle of the family, and so in a lot of ways that makes sense then. Strangers are rarely accused of child sexual abuse. 3% for the younger children, 12% for kids, the adolescent group. This idea of this molester hiding in the bushes and ready to grab your kid and not the case. It's almost always someone who the child knows and sadly probably trusts as well. Offending tends to last longer for younger children, I think because the older children have a better capacity to say no. More of the cases that involved penetration was with the older children. And the most typical type of sexual offender is an acquaintance of the family or the child. I would think that would be the extra familial person because 62% of one group and 40% of another are family members. I want to talk a little bit about IPV and incest. We'll talk about the dynamics about how things develop. And I first learned of this process actually some years back when I attended, I think it was an 11-day training session on working with sexual abuse perpetrators and victims. It was kind of an all-encompassing training at the Giarretto Institute in San Jose. I'm not sure they're there anymore. I know that Giarretto died some years ago, and so I'm sure the organization continues, but what the name is, I'm not sure. This is where I first learned about this and wanted to share this. This is also mentioned in our textbook, so obviously this is still a process that the experts in the field are aware of. When a daughter is molested by her father, or it could be a stepfather in this case, but let's just say father, oftentimes the individual is physically abusive, is a batterer of a spouse, and the violence of the husband leads to all sorts of physical and emotional problems for the wife, as we've already touched on. As a result, she may really have a little ability to be able to be involved with her children and to be sensitive to what's happening with her kids. At the same time, becomes probably less and less emotionally available to her husband, and probably she may be forced into sexual interactions, but that sex is less mutual, I suppose you would say, than it had been at one time. In this process, both parents sometimes can be violent towards the children. The daughter becomes old enough now that she begins to develop sexually, and this reminds the father of her mother, his wife, when she was younger and more sexually attractive. And the father now feels that the mother isn't really fulfilling him sexually any longer and begins to see his daughter as an alternative. And he becomes very loving to her, perhaps gives her special favors, has special days together, those kinds of things. Part of the grooming process, of course. And the daughter understandably responds to his attention and maybe for the first time in a long time begins to feel loved by one of her parents. He becomes more aggressive, pushier with her, and begins to seek intercourse with her. And if her mother is aware of it, and again, referring back to what I said a few moments ago about the untreated adult victims oftentimes can't really deal with what's going on with their children, though she may feel very powerless if she finds out and might fear for her own safety. The daughter might not reach out for help. She may be socially isolated, but even if she's not, she may find that the attention and some power she gets in her relationship with her father and in the family system is something that is attractive to her, and this discourages her from reporting out. Just describing the dynamic that goes into this, it's not her fault that this is happening. This is a dynamic that occurs. In effect, she becomes a second wife to him. Sometimes she may take on some of the household roles that the mother once had, but certainly becomes the object of his attention and his affection. And in fact, he becomes very jealous of her and her other relationships. She might also become victim of violence just like her mother. And if she tries to reach out and to date other boys, fathers often disapproving may try to keep her from that, and she knows that. And all of this makes her very fearful of her father. While all this is going on, whether the mother realizes it is going on or not, oftentimes a rift in the relationship between the mother and the daughter has developed, and that the father really is capitalizing upon that in his relationship with his daughter. In the end, the dynamics in the household are very troubled. She may stay also if she has younger siblings because she fears that this process will go on with her younger siblings as well. She may choose to run away. She may get pregnant so that whether to the father or to a boyfriend in order to end the sexual interaction. If she's running away, she's on the streets, she may wind up having to turn to prostitution because, one of the things that she learned through her interactions with her father is that her value has a lot to do with her sexuality. or she may have psychological problems, dissociation, and those kinds of things arising from this. So in treatment, and again, I'm not going to go into this in depth, but one of the things that was focused upon in the training that I had was that when the sexual abuse becomes known and when it is stopped, the perpetrator being arrested or being out of the home, the first thing that is very important is to begin to work on the mother-daughter relationship and to strengthen that once again, because there's such a serious rift because of this process that she's not going to be able to seek any protection from her mother otherwise. And of course, it's going to be very important for mom, if she has some unresolved victim issues herself from her childhood, to deal with those issues as well. So it's a very complicated treatment process. A few more slides and we'll be done. The rate of substantiated maltreatment you see here from 1990 to 2017, again, about a 30-year period, a little less than that, you see is by and large declining. There was a spike in around the turn of the century, but it is declining, and this is overall maltreatment, I believe. Reports of physical abuse and sexual abuse have decreased. Reports of neglect have increased, which may cause the ponderous statistic consumer to wonder if perhaps things aren't getting reported as abuse anymore, but are being reported as neglect for some reason. Another statistic that we should look at is child fatalities from abuse and neglect. In 2019, I think I mentioned earlier that well over 1,800 children died from child maltreatment in 2019. Here's a breakdown of the nature of the abuse or maltreatment that explained the death. And this is more than 100% because many of these situations involve more than one type of abuse. So there'd be a combination of physical abuse and neglect. And you see here, 73% involve neglect, 44% involve physical abuse. Those are the two most common substantiated findings. These are child fatalities. So the low rate of sexual abuse isn't that low in terms of substantiations. This is cases that resulted in the death of a child. But what you see here is that, again, the children 1 year and younger are at the highest risk. 45% of those children who died because of child maltreatment in 2019 were less than 1 year old. And of course, the younger the child, greater the risk. And this graph shows this very clearly. Fatalities by relationship to perpetrator. Another interesting statistic shows that the highest percentage of the abuser was a mother only in these cases, but followed fairly closely by two parents being the abuser. Maybe one of the explanations, again, why the Strauss studies suggest that women are more violent in their intimate relationships than men. Mothers are oftentimes the single parent in the home. There isn't a father there. There are a number of reasons why mothers would have a higher representation in this study, I believe. Mothers are the primary caretaker. They're the ones that are considered responsible for the children in traditional thinking. So there's a number of reasons why women would be represented more in this particular graph. But again, an interesting statistic to look at. What are the characteristics of families that reduce the likelihood of abuse? Such things as a supportive family environment, nurturing parenting skills, parents that understand how to parent without the use of being physical, without punishment that involves physical interventions, a home with structure and rules that results in predictability for kids, which means it's going to be a calmer household. Live in communities that are protective of families. Age-appropriate supervision of children, a very important area. Parents employed so that economic worries are reduced. There's adequate housing, access to health care, access to social services, and extended family support is another thing that can't be overrated. And so all of these kinds of things, and there may be some other areas as well, reduce the likelihood of abuse in situations that may otherwise be troubling for families. Finally, and this is our last slide, the United Nations says that no violence against children is justifiable. Let me jump down below here. I mentioned earlier in the semester about my Swedish exchange student saying he couldn't understand why a parent would want to hit a child. And I said he grew up in an environment where parents just didn't do that. And this report here from a document called Hitting Children is Wrong said that very thing. Sweden has been able to follow the effect of its ban on corporal punishment with repeated studies using the same methodology over a 40-year period. So these statistics are probably pretty solid. 2 years after the ban was implemented, more than 90% of Swedish adults were aware of the law. And while 90% of the parents in Sweden spanked their children in the 1970s, less than 10% did so in 2000, and even less in the last survey in 2016. Can social change happen? Yes. I would think back to the change in our beliefs about smoking and how the whole culture around smoking changed so dramatically just in my lifetime alone. If we can do that with smoking, an addictive behavior, we can do that with just about anything, I think, and certainly with a violent environment and an environment that encourages and permits the physical discipline of children. For the majority of young Swedish parents, spanking is not an option and is looked on as adverse behavior. There are probably many reasons behind this positive outcome, including early political consensus, a welfare state, and a comparatively well-educated population. But the map, if you'll notice here, stands out. The United States is a different color than the rest of the world, and that's because all of the members in the United Nations have ratified the Human Rights Conventions for the protection of the child, except for the United States. We signed the convention, but we never had it ratified. No president has presented it. Obama, early in his administration, indicated, or perhaps when he was running, that it was embarrassing that we hadn't ratified it and that we stood alone or nearly alone. Somalia was the only other nation the last time I looked, but now it has ratified it as of 2015. And Obama said it was embarrassing that we hadn't ratified it, but he never presented the conventions to Congress. And there's a lot of speculation about that because of the conservative values and the notion that the government should not be stepping into the domain of the family. Man's home is his castle. Many religions, believe in the use of corporal punishment when necessary to properly raise your children. All of these kinds of things probably go into this, but I just thought it was interesting that, we are the lone, and Human Rights Convention isn't just about child abuse and neglect. It also involves things like human trafficking and all the other kinds of things that affect children. We are the only nation that hasn't ratified it in the world, and I think that's a sad statement about our culture. As of 2020, 59 nations have banished corporal punishment of children altogether. We are far away from that. So, on that note, I will close this talk, and as always, I trust that there's some information in here that may be new and useful to you. Questions, if there are any, please bring them to class. I'd be happy to talk about this more. Thank you.